Hello and welcome to our pilot episode. My name is Justin.
And I'm Jarmo.
And I'm AJ,
And this is going to hurt.
and this is
This
going to
is
hurt.
going to hurt.
Yeah, all at the same time. Yeah, perfect.
The
We're on it.
reasons why we are doing this podcast is because we've discovered, integrated, and absorbed a lot of content from the world in what we would probably describe as a disillusionment to the common narratives out there, a lot of the common status quo beliefs, because we have found that what we are being told does not track and stack up to reality as we experience it. So we'll be covering that there is an issue, which many people probably already know, with an emphasis on there are solutions. And so, by the nature of discerning truth in this process that we have of gathering information, finding out how they fit together in a non contradictory manner, and coming to validated conclusions because of this, let's start with some of the grammar about who we are and why we're doing some of this. Jarmo, will you take us away?
Well, I'm just an average Joe, basically, who has read a lot of books and compared the text to the outside world and found out that they are not, correlating with each other. And then I started to read some more and do some digging. And, I'm still on the path.
I'd say you're anything but average, maybe at one time to have started. But there's more
Yeah,
than meets the eye.
what I mean by average is that everybody can do this. You don't have to be like, a university type of personality. Everyone can do it if they want to, if they choose to.
Well said. And AJ.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I wouldn't consider myself, you know, I mean, I've got no university degrees. Just got high school, and I did do 1 year university, but I was like, nah, there's something not quite right. This is not for me. So yeah, but yeah, as similar to Yarmo, I sort of realized sort of early on that things weren't quite right, and so I didn't really find that school had actually prepared me for the world really. It didn't really teach me how the world actually worked, and so what ends up happening is that you finish high school and then you sort of it's a war really. It's a war out there. You have to make your sort of make a bit of space for yourself, but at the same time, if you're not confident, because like for me, I wasn't really confident because I just didn't know how things really worked, and so for a while I sort of just followed, I guess, just followed what your boss says, and you just sort of keep quiet, and you just hope that you're going to learn something and figure it out, but you never really do, and then you fall into this machine, and you just keep on keeping on, I guess, right, as the song goes. But it's just yeah, I don't know. So it's only years later that I was thinking, okay, I feel I need to do something about this. And so I started reading and reading lots of books. I tried to get my hands on first-hand sources. And that's pretty much my journey. I guess it took me all the way up to today. So it's been years now, probably a decade, close to a decade that I've been down this path.
Excellent. And the two of you have a bit more time in this truth content arena than I do. I think it's worth noting here we have three different generations from three different countries, allotting three different perspectives. I am in my 20s. Now, when I was 19, 20 years old, I met a man who was versed in the classic liberal arts. We'll touch on that in this episode a bit later. And I thought I was a smart enough person. I chose not to go to college. I dropped out after the first semester, but school was relatively, easy enough. but it didn't prepare me. And when I met somebody that knew how to think and had a method for how to think and had practiced it time and time again, he could intellectually run laps around me. And so it started me looking into what is the Trivium? What is the classic liberal arts? What are these lost tools of learning that have been hidden from our schooling system, and why were they hidden? This led me to a lot of Richard Grove's work, as was a common platform that the three of us met, mostly chatting about Grand Theft World and autonomy. Now, this show's not sponsored by those things. It's just worth noting that there is value over there, and that's one of the things that brought this all together. So I tend to lean on more of the humanistic, mystical, spiritual side, the consciousness, the truth in our inner experience. But even that does have to be juxtaposed with, this is how the world really works geopolitically, and this is the current situation of the human race. And for the most part, what I've found is that is an intellectual dynamic, a power differential, because they have knowledge that we don't and are withheld. So the emphasis and desire that I have with this podcast is an education, a sharing of this information so that people can liberate themselves.
Well said.
Now, as this is episode number 1, I think it would be fruitful to follow a bit of a pattern as we're going by grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So this episode will be our grammar, because there's a lot of ground to cover, and it's easy to get confused with what we're talking about if we don't know how to define our terms, and it's very easy to misconstrue something if we're not on shared common arrangements. So what do you guys say? Should we get into some of this grammar, or do we want to take a look at that clip by Christine Anderson? Maybe save that for a little bit later?
Yeah, I reckon we get into a bit of grammar first, and then I think Christine Anderson would be a good clip to illustrate some of that.
Excellent.
Agreed.
So first up on our roster would be the dynamic itself of freedom versus slavery. You guys want to take a crack at defining those?
Well, what is freedom? Freedom is a concept that the individual can make decisions about his life or her life without any oppression or force feeding or threatening, and that one can not necessarily do anything he or she wants. But basically, the line is that when you start to do harm to others, then you cross the line. You should be free to do things in your life in the boundaries that you don't hurt anybody.
It sounds like natural law to a degree, where a right is any action that does not cause harm to another human being.
Yes.
Yeah. I'd go straight to because freedom, obviously, for me, I find that it's something it's hard to actually describe and put into words, right? It's not easy to define. So the way I sort of look at things sometimes is I sort of think, okay, well, sometimes, yeah, for certain things it is worth wrecking your brains out. But sometimes I sort of think, well, I'll just have a look at a dictionary, or I'll have a look at etymology, which we'll probably get into that as well at some point. So here I'll just go. I've just on my end, I've just decided to do a quick search for the definition of freedom. The Cambridge Dictionary Online just says it's a noun. It's the condition or right of being able or allowed to do, say, think, etc., whatever you want to without being controlled or limited. And they give a few examples of it. Like, for example, I felt such a sense of freedom up in the hills alone. Children are allowed much more freedom these days, but that doesn't really illustrate exactly what it is. But so looking as well, just that quickly looking at Wikipedia, they've got an entry for it, and I know Wikipedia is not necessarily a source of reference because you can edit it and all sorts of stuff. But it's usually, I find it's usually quite a good starting point. And there, in terms of the philosophical aspect, they call it a concept of philosophy. And again, here they say freedom is the power or right to act, speak, and change as one wants without hindrance or restraint. Freedom is often associated with liberty and autonomy in the sense of giving oneself one's own laws. Okay, so that's that aspect of it. But as Jarmo mentioned as well, you can't just go around and say, I'm absolutely free, I can do whatever I want, in the sense that it wouldn't be right to just go around killing people because you just felt like it, right? Because we do live as as part of society, and so there are certain, you could say, philosophical and individual restraints that one has to practice every day, really, so that we can all get along and not go to war.
Absolutely. And there's further discernment inside of that too, because freedom in a pejorative is almost like solipsism. Like people just believe they can do what they want and cause harm without repercussion. And that's destructive to a society. I mean, to earn freedom in a world that isn't free takes a whole lot of responsibility. Now, another way that freedom can be defined is juxtaposed to slavery, because freedom would be the state of being that there is no slavery. Because if nobody has power over anybody else, by definition, everybody would be free to rule their own life the way that they see fit. And slavery, of course, would be the oppression of another. It would be the subjugation of another. And it's really important that we recognize there are still many people out there that believe that slavery is exclusively defined by whips and chains. But I would posit, is somebody enslaved who was force-fed ideas that are not true and do not collaborate with reality, and because they believe these ideas, they act in ways that they would not of their own self-accord? Is somebody who has been indoctrinated or mind control, even though they're making choices of their own free will, is it freedom if the perceptions that they have guiding those choices were not theirs to begin with? I guess we'll discover and find out as we go through this. But certainly, slavery goes beyond whips and chains. I mean, blackmail.
Oh yeah, if you think about taxation, taxation is a form of slavery. And I don't have a problem with that, somebody collecting taxes, as long as I can have some sort of like an input where the money goes. Because there are big projects that need big funding, like infrastructure, healthcare, and so on. I'd be happy to pay taxes on them. But the thing is that with government, most of the money goes into things that are not beneficial to individual. And that's a big problem.
It's a huge problem. Would you say those taxes are more appropriate going to a governmental agency that promises these good things for you? Or would you reckon that you had your own small community and you each put in a tithe to the group, and all of a sudden you now have a pool of shared resources with people you're immediately surrounded by to come decisions on how to use that to your benefit? And would it be taxation
I'd
at
go
that
with the
point?
smaller community. I'd go with the smaller community, definitely. And you know, history shows that that's very easy to do, and also the community that is which is formed and which pool the money to common uses, it can be done very efficiently and very successfully. So that's not an issue if somebody thinks that, you know, there's not going to be enough money for, let's say, like, you know, bridges or hospitals or something like that. That's just not true. If you look at the history, it has been done way back very successfully.
Now, this does lead
Just a
us
matter
into defining.
how.
Well, sure. And I mean, at least here in America, you know, it is highly unlikely that the taxes collected each year will ever go to anything except the interest on the national debt. I'm not sure how that's like in other parts of the world, but we have such an enormous range of debt that the taxes that are collected, they don't even go to the stuff that we think they're going to. Because that stuff's already been paid for with debt. And our taxes are just how the government is paying back the interest to the privately owned central bank.
Big problem.
I'm going to throw something in there to
Yes.
destabilize part of that conversation because so my background is I used to work in the financial services industry before, and it's changed. I've changed my perspective on a lot of things, including money. What is money? I think over time I've changed as well my perspective on what it is. So you know, for me, the concept of money, I find it quite interesting because most people use it every day, and yet they don't understand really where it comes from. They don't understand how it can be used to manipulate them. So money, okay, at its basic level, you could probably say, I mean, maybe the average person might, when I say average, I'm average as well, but I mean, the common guy that hasn't looked into some of the stuff or hasn't really stopped to question some of the things that he uses every day, his common definition might be something to the effect of money is a tool to get things to move, right? So it's a tool that is a bit more convenient than bartering, which is, you know, okay, yeah, that is one use of it. But I also see it as something from which you can control people with. So if I try and really dissect what money is, I sort of see it as the energy of your labor that is expressed in mathematical form. So it's measured with numbers, therefore. So it's the measurement of your energy translated into an accountancy system that we call banking. And so, you know, you've got ledgers and all these sort of things. But so where I'm getting at is that if that is the case, it's a way of harvesting your energy in a way and passing it on to the next person. So, you know, so as to have some sort of well, the numbers would determine the value or the value of the energy that you've put into a product. But if there's another way to harvest your energy, I mean, we touched upon slavery earlier on. Slavery is another, like, you know, typically with the chains, that is another way of harvesting people's energy. You get people to do something by force. So there is something within money that is driving people and making people do stuff without them actually. So there's a pursuit of money, right?
Mm.
And I think this is what the state of affairs is today. People have got this belief in money, and they're scared if they don't have any because they can't pay their bills, which is corporations, and so therefore they have to go to work and have three jobs, and it's the whole system for me uh, is sort of like a control system. But I also play devil's advocate with myself. I also think, well, what is the alternative? Is there a better way of doing it? Well, that's a very big debate to be had. But it just seems to me that whether it's technology or money or any of these types of tools that we use as human beings, well, it's a double-edged sword all the time. And there's a part of it is, yes, it helps your life a bit, maybe makes certain things a bit easier. It's convenient, but on the flip side, you give up something from the past, and you give up maybe part of your culture and your old ways of your old ways of doing things. So there's always like a downfall to it, and maybe with all these efficiencies and that we have going today, and all these sort of double-edged sword things, the more we start to develop more and more tools, the more control there is on the flip side of it. So it just seems to me there's some sort of paradox going on there.
You know, I think you're really hitting the nail on the head there, with money in essence being a stored form of value that can be transacted, whether that's the value from your labor or your services. But more or less, it's just there to represent that it's something of value. And then other people see that thing having value, so it's accepted as a currency. Whether or not a piece of paper backed by debt has value, answer, it doesn't. It doesn't matter, because it's national currency. It's a believed in, trusted, backed. Your bank is FDIC insured here in America. It's like it has all these official stamps and seals of approvals. People are like, well, gung ho. That's what we're gonna do. That's what we're gonna use it with. Despite the fact that it hasn't been tied to gold since 1971. And of course, I am just speaking for the US dollar here, but it's certainly a method of enslavement. You know, we had talked about the knowledge gap being a method of enslavement, but this financial gap is as well. When we have a system that's designed in such a way that our classes of society are more or less separated by how much money you have. It's almost the number one defining factor as far as, you know, lower class, middle class, upper class, elites. All these different categorizations are, well, how much money do you have? And maybe we could do it better. You know, maybe there could be a decentralized bank, decentralized, where people can go and take out loans, and the interest that they pay on those loans counts as their taxes. And all of a sudden, you have a surplus in a decentralized bank that can be spent in a decentralized way. I don't know. That's a big project. I'm not signing up for it. I'm just saying there's probably better solutions out there than privately owned central banks loaning money to governments to mostly fund wars at the cost of the lives of those people and at the cost of the debt incurred on the future generations of those people from an entity that just makes that money out of thin air in the first place.
Yeah.
I'm sure we could do a whole episode on our on money into the future.
I'm gonna throw something in here. Here in Finland, we used to have government-owned central bank until the early 90s, and our national debt was something like 35 million euros. Of course, euro wasn't back then, but you know, when it changed it to the euros, and the system worked as you know, the government lended money from a central bank. They had their limits, how much they can lend, and they paid back with interest to the central bank. And then they had more money to lend to the government. So it was like self-feeding system, but it wasn't internationally owned. It was owned by the Finnish state. And that was very prosperous for Finland. Very prosperous, because Finland was a poor country, a very poor country after the wars. And then we had these war reparations that we had to pay to the Soviet Union. And we didn't have that much factories, but you know, the central bank gave money to government, and government allocated money for certain sectors, like in industry or healthcare. And actually, it's the same system that South Korea had. And if you look at South Korea now, you know, they have this tech giant, Samsung, LG, you know, Hyundai, and things like that. And they have built their system with the same recipe that Finland had. But then we have this great itch to get to these big tables where the big boys are. And we we joined in European Union in 1995. And after that, our national debt has, you know, it's something like $130 million, a million euros now. So it has like multiplied many times in like 20 or 30 years. So banking system itself can be used wisely or poorly.
And if we've been able to reason that a debt is a form of slavery, what does it mean for nations that go into debt to privately owned banks? If it works on the level of individual human beings, I'm not sure how it would be different for nation states. Now,
well, with the debt comes legislation, which is like in Finland, 70 to 80% new laws comes from the European Union. Basically, they are done there and they are only ratified here.
For those of you who may be incredulous or curious or want to learn more about this subject of central banks and the financial gap between the people and the people who own the banks, if you haven't checked it out, there will be a link that pops up over here to James Corbett's documentary, A Century of Enslavement, which covers this very topic. For the purposes of not shooting past our time on this, we can always touch this topic a bit later. Let's talk about the difference between schooling and education.
Well, schooling is, for me, is that something that somebody else decides what you're going to learn for their purposes. Whereas education is something that the individual has an interest on. So the whole setting is so fundamentally different.
And what is that?
You school your dog. You school your dog. You don't educate it. You school your dog to behave in a certain manner in certain situations.
That's a really good point. Yeah, you don't teach the dog how to open the gate and run around outside.
Yes. Or how to have, like, you know, a good day, you know, just, you know, eat at breakfast and then go to the fields running and enjoying itself.
And Jarmo, could you help us understand the etymological root of education?
I pass.
Oh, okay. I got my book of etymology back here.
Well, whilst you grabbing
yes.
your book and having a look at it, I'll just quickly go on the online etymology dictionary. I just typed educate, and I've just, we'll probably post it on the screen at one point. But here it says mid 15th century educaten, bring up children to train. From Latin educatus, past participle of educare, to bring up, rear, educate. Source also of Italian educare, Spanish educar, French eduquer, which is a frequentative of or otherwise related to educere, bring out, lead forth, etc., etc., etc. And they give here, they say, according to Century Dictionary, educere of a child is usually with reference to bodily nurture or support, while educare refers more frequently to the mind. And there is no authority for the common statement that the primary sense of education is to draw out or unfold the powers of the mind. So that's the etymology online.
And that is rather fascinating because education, by that definition, would imply that there's things that we already know, or those things that we already are able to understand if we are led to those things. Am I reading that correctly, do you think? I've got educate up here, but I'm looking for schooling for some comparison. SCH.
I just throw in here that, the history of schooling starts in the early 1900s. There were two reasons for the school system to be developed. One is war and army, and the other one was at the time there was this industrial revolution. So they needed a workforce, obedient workforce, who knew just enough to do their job, but that was it.
And not too much to be dissatisfied with their job.
Exactly. And before that, there weren't any public schools, monasteries and things like that.
One-room
were happening.
Houses.
But and also there were like these roaming teachers that went one village to another and held a summer school or something like that for the local children. But there was nothing like a centralized curriculum or anything like that. And the schooling or education at that time, the need for that was like, to educate children on the broader aspects, maybe learn how to read and things like that. But when the industrial revolution and the Prussian War happened, then they realized that, oh no, we don't want people who think too much or question orders. So we need obedient workforce or army personnel who will do as they are told.
You bring up two really interesting points here, because you're talking about there were two purposes for education, and one was militaristic and one was based on the Industrial Revolution. And the system that our modern education comes from, and there will be a link over here to an interview with John Taylor Gatto, it is derived from Prussia, the Prussian modern-day Germany. Military system was a multi-year indoctrination program so that they would have a willing population to go out and do battle, potentially die, and not run away from the battlefield, following orders and not thinking too freely of their own accord. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was primarily the Fords, Carnegies, and Rockefellers that had an interest in this system insofar as it applies to America. Now, the Prussian schooling system was brought to most parts of the world in our day and age now for about 100 years. But here in America, they said, we want that. These people will wait at a stop sign on the road. These people will listen to orders when somebody in a uniform tells them what to do. But we don't need a huge base of soldiers right now because we have this big industrial revolution, like you were talking about, Yarmo. So they brought in the Prussian military indoctrination system and they made it an American consumer indoctrination system. And it's the same sort of program that's going on most other parts of the world. Certainly the Japanese took the Prussian constitution, word for word translated, and brought in the Prussian schooling. And now instead of a militaristic culture, we have a consumer culture, all the while with a active literacy rate and even an ability to read and understand basic instructions having gone downhill dramatically since the introduction of public schooling.
Yeah, in Europe, for instance, in Finland, the Prussian system came from Sweden and also from Russia. So we were like sandwiched between the two. And it was it came here in the mid 1900s. And
are they still called gymnasiums? Your schools there?
Yeah. And the thing is that it's very effective. That's why it has spread all over the world, because it's a magnificent tool to subjugate people, to indoctrinate people. Like you go to your school and then you get your loan that you can buy an apartment or a house. Then you work the rest of your life paying that. And at the same time, you are not building your own dream. You are building somebody else's. You are building, companies, so they can fulfill their goals. But at the same time, you are wasting your life away. And then when you are old, they just ditch you, and the next generation comes in.
Yeah, once you get skilled, there's always a cheaper workforce to take your place.
Yes.
Why do you guys think it is if we're able to see the symptoms of this system, right? Like here in America, a child would have been a productive member of society by 7, 8 years old, 12 years at the latest. And now we're to the point where 18 years old is highly questionable whether it's actually a developed person that's able to be a productive member of society. And on top of that, you're encouraged to go to 4 more years of education. And what we know of from learning is you have to be comfortable. It has more to do with observation than it does to do with active thinking. The most important skill sets are active literacies. And it doesn't take all that long to learn something. And more importantly, is active practice with these things. How is it that we've been able to extend that delayed adolescence so far that we have uncomfortable chairs with brick walls, 45-minute timers, shortened attention spans, and 12 years of the same exact thing, with virtually nobody coming out of the system having the wherewithal to guide their own life in autonomy? Why do you think it is that we're still doing the same thing?
Because
go ahead, Yarmo. Yep.
Because it's a very effective system, and also they teach so much unnecessary skills and knowledge and things that you don't really need. I mean, like if you look at small children, why can't they have like 2 hours, maybe 3 at tops, like mathematics or literature or things like that, and the rest of the day could be like dancing and playing and just what children do. But no, they have to be indoctrinated to the system, and they have to do it like every day, all day long, many years. So it's basically it's built into you, and if you look at the society and people, they don't even question this. Very few do. They don't question because it has been like hammered into them that this is your life, this is how it's gonna be, and you better do it, and maybe you can have a decent life. But one thing that is certain is that you won't fulfill your dreams. And I'm talking like in general now. Of course, there are individuals who can fulfill at least some of their dreams, but for most of it, it's going to be you are going to be a slave.
Yeah. To try and answer your question, Justin, I mean, it is a very good question, but it's very hard to. There's a lot of things to unpack in that one question. Now, I'd just like to backtrack just a little bit, and I think this might give us as well some of the pointers as well to answer your question. Whilst you guys were talking earlier on, I did a quick search for a book online that I know it's called The Leipzig Connection by Paolo Leone, which was written in 1993. And I'll just read the description of it, right? So it says, in the shadows of the Bismarck's totalitarian Germany in 1875, a little-known medical researcher laid the groundwork for a subject that in modern times was to bring American education to its knees, which is behavioral psychology. A latter-day disciple, B.F. Skinner, later wrote the book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, arguing that such ancient conceptions are these are luxuries our brave new world can no longer afford. Another ardent follower, John Dewey, who's considered the father of American education, took the new radical German redefinition of education to mean the reprogramming of young brains and nervous systems, and applied it to his self-appointed task of creating in America the ideal socialist state. John D. Rockefeller, for purposes of his own, bankrolled what was in effect a hostile takeover of our educational system. The Leipzig Connection is a startling account of how and why these things came about. It lays out in concise detail the story of the development of the educational malaise which we have unknowingly dropped our children into, explaining not only the declining SAT scores and the phenomenon of high school graduates who are barely literate, but also symptoms even more sinister, such as violence, prostitution, and drug dealing in the schools, the self-mutilation of tattooing and body piercing, and teenage suicide. So that's, I know, apologies, it's quite a long summary, but it seems to be quite an interesting book that traces back some of these, you could say, founding fathers of the American education. So that's one aspect of it. So if anybody wants to acquire that book and read it, I would recommend to do so. It gives you a good perspective as to what's going on. And also what came to mind when you guys were talking is Charlotte Iserby. She wrote another book called The Dumbing Down of America. That is also looking into the education system. I believe she was under, was it what, Ronald Reagan administration, I think it was. So that's also one that will be worth reading. But yeah, so just to quickly go back to your question, it does seem that in order to maintain stability in a society, the powers that be, whether they're historical or only new, they are trying to, when they say keep or preserve stability of a nation, well, what does that entail really? Lots of things under the guise of national security. So it seems that it's in the interest of the corporations and the billionaires to keep people in the dark so that they are easily manipulable. Is that a word? Yeah. Yeah, so that they can sell products, but at the same time, when people buy the products, they'll need to go to work to get that money back. And so you're in this sort of system where you're just stuck in this never-ending loop. You're not wise. You're not wiser than you were the day before, and you're spending your money. Oh, now I've got no money and I've got debt. I need to go to work again. And once I go to work, I can spend my money again, and etc., etc., and round you go. So it just seems that those that are trying to get out of that, not the system as such, but are trying to get freedom of thought and freedom of speech in order to express what you're thinking or what you are able to observe. It seems that those that are trying to express that to other people and relay that information, well, they're not really desirable by the powers that be, it seems. So that's another angle.
That's really interesting because it almost seems like the schools and the banks go hand in hand. Not only did big money come in to set the schooling system in motion, but if we use an analogy of a hamster wheel, it's like school teaches you or indoctrinates you into that hamster wheel is the only thing that exists. And if you want a bigger hamster wheel, you go to college, but either way, you're going to be in the hamster wheel. And the hamster wheel itself is the banking system and the consumer society of, well, it's only $200 a month for me to finance this boat for the next 20 years. And then all of a sudden, a job is necessary, and you have a house or a mortgage or what have you, and it's like you don't get out of that system. The good old fashioned phrase of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, it's been gamified by this point. You have to be smarter than the system, which isn't easy because the system definitely does not want you to be smarter than it. That's why they had to introduce public school in the first place.
Right. So can we sort of then agree or conclude that public school is there to serve other interests than yourself?
Yes. Yes. Public school is antithetical to education, being that it does not draw out your natural intelligence, perception, problem solving, and pattern recognition abilities. It simply puts in beliefs, ideas, and conditioning of how the people who fund the schooling system want the outcome of a mass population. And if you want an education, you have to look elsewhere.
Yeah, in a way, you are like people are farmed to do certain things, and they get these petty rewards, which actually are pretty meaningless. It's like, a hamster living in a cage, and when the clock strikes 2, it'll get food. When the clock strikes 4, it'll get water. And he's happy. He doesn't know that there's something else because it has been conditioned to live in a cage.
Which goes back to my definition of money earlier on, when I said that it is a way of harvesting the energy of your labor. We could say that school is the harvester of your mind and energy as well. But preparing to put it into labor, preparing your mind to put it into labor, that will serve other interests than yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, why
so
does school not teach
Slavelandia,
us to make
as
an offer?
Gerald Salente would say.
And also the schooling system, it gives you certain options, which can be totally different, which the child is attracted to. Like somebody can be really autistic, but in school they teach you that, if you want to be an artist, you're going to suffer financially a lot, and probably you won't make it.
And
so they give
teach people
these
how to make
options
their own
which are
offers.
suitable for them.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say quickly, even when you look at the structure of the school, like the infrastructure, sorry, if you just look at it, I mean, I don't know what it was like when you guys were growing up, but I think I'm 12 years older than Justin, and I'm 12 years younger than Jarmo. So I was growing up in Belgium, and the way it was is you had the bell, right, that would ring. So there's a bit of behaviorism going on there where, okay, that's, you know, they're wanting a reaction once you've heard something that's going to, you know, it's going to stimulate your brain, I guess. And then once you hear that bell, you had all the school children that would run towards, you know, paint that was on the floor that would mark your classroom number, right? And you'd have to wait for your teacher to come and collect you, or to come in to wait for all the school kids to wait in a line, hold hands behind this white line on the floor, and then the teacher would come and collect you and take you to your classroom. So it is very much a disciplinary type of behavior, or type of methodology, I would say, is really to discipline you, but to socialize you. So, but when I say socialize you, it's to mold you into the normal, what is normal, right? It's the normal citizen. The normal citizen is how they mold you into this. I guess we could say dumbed down human being that is just going to follow orders and obey all the time, and that's the goal of public schooling, really. So it's a bit more like a prison, isn't it?
Hey, what's the
It's a
difference
cage.
between a school bus and a prison bus?
Colors, or maybe not.
Yeah, that's it.
Nothing.
Okay, now this breaches us into a little bit of a different topic, but along the same lines, because if schooling was effective and taught us how to discern truth, propaganda would never be an issue. But because schooling does not teach us how to discern truth, and it allows us to hold contradictory ideas in our mind and not know how to validate either of them, propaganda is possible. AJ, our resident propaganda expert, what can you do to shed some light on this subject that we may better understand?
Oh, man, you've put me on the spot there. No, well, yeah. So, first of all, propaganda, it's a huge topic. It includes so many things that we don't really think about most of the things that we go through every day. But a lot of what we experience every day is, well, the results or direct propaganda as well. So I will refer to a book here that I don't know if you guys can see it properly. It's Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes, and it's written by a Frenchman called Jacques Ellul. Now, this book was written in 1962 in French, and it was only translated into English in 1965. Basically, what Jacques Ellul writes in there, well, basically, just to give you a brief rundown of who he is and why we should be listening to him. Jacques Ellul was a French professor. He was teaching, I can't remember which university it was in Paris, but he basically went through German occupation through the Second World War. He got kicked out of the university because for what he was teaching. And so after the war, he decided to write a bunch of books. I think he describes himself as a Christian anarchist, and he has written another book called The Technological Society, which we could get into maybe another day, but we'll just talk about this one that Jacques Ellul is talking about. So, Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes. Now, in there, he describes something that he calls pre-propaganda, which is basically trying to lay the ground before you can use propaganda. Typically, he mentions school as a form of pre-propaganda because it's a way of socializing you and preparing you to be propagandized or subjected to information that will shape your behavior and your attitudes. So that's one aspect of it. He then moves on to talk about agitation propaganda, which is typically the type of propaganda that would be used by, well, not just governments, but corporations as well. So typically, corporations, would sell you a nice car, but they'll put a good-looking girl in the advert, and so you are supposed to make the association between sex and beauty, maybe, with and the car, and therefore that's supposed to make you want to buy the car. But obviously, all those are part of logical fallacies and that type of thing. But in terms of a government, when would they use agitation propaganda? Well, that would be, in other words, wanting the public to back them up and to agree with going to war. So, in other words, agitation propaganda is to get you to act in the now, and the certain things that it uses is to increase your emotion, because once you are under a heightened state of emotion, you will be more susceptible and suggestible as well to agreeing. And so those are just little examples. And the next type of propaganda he describes would be integration propaganda. So that purpose of integration, as an example for the Americans that are listening, would be the American dream is an example of integration propaganda. So typically it would be a form of propaganda that will try to make you fall in line and to calm you down and to give you an objective to go to work and to want these, nice cars and to want a big house and to want a nice garden and a perfect family and that type of thing. So if we could try and summarize what propaganda is, it is information, but it's also what is it? You could also include in there symbols as a type of information. Stereotypes, myths and ideologies. There's all sorts of stuff really that you can include in that.
Would you say that all propaganda is a fallacy? Is it all based on fallacies?
I would sort of say that not necessarily, no. But I think for me, the more important question is propaganda necessary? So what are the intentions behind it? And maybe you can then think a bit more about your fallacies then after that. You could sort of think of it in terms of the battle of good and evil. Now, I'm pretty sure most people that may be watching this would probably reject propaganda completely and would want it out of their lives completely. Which, yeah, I mean, I always used to believe that, and I think I still do, because I don't believe in manipulating people and making them believe that it's their free will, that they are doing all these things because they are free. I believe more in explaining to people what tools have been used against them, so that they are more aware and then they can push back when they are subjected to it. Now, I could go a little bit deeper, but there are also lots of effects of propaganda. Some people are left scarred for life, psychologically. And, you have the neurosis, so high anxiety and depression that comes the results out of it. Because you're subjected into so much information. So typically, we could look at some of the tools or ways of distributing propaganda. I mean, I think we touched upon it a little bit earlier on with the industrial revolutions of the past. We had the printing press, but then we have the radio came about, and then television, which is a massive one, especially after World War II. And today, we've got the internet, and social media is probably the worst. Is it a surprise that we're seeing a high or more and more increase in depressions and anxiety within the youth as well. You know, I mean, they've got social media following them in their pocket 24/7. So
We could
I have
certainly
a
do a
comment.
whole episode about propaganda. Go ahead, Yarmo.
Would you say that like information or education, schooling can be categorized as propaganda? But the one thing that separates education from propaganda is that if you are educated, you have a freedom to choose what to do with that information. Like in propaganda, you are bent to a certain behavioral outcome. But as in education, the information is given and you get to choose what to do with it.
well, I would comment on that and also say that you do not necessarily know when you're subjected to propaganda. We all have, and sometimes we don't really realize it. Because you could also do, for example, you could, you could use propaganda, or you could use statistics to lie or to mislead people, and you'd believe, and those statistics are actually true, right? They're right, they're correct, but it could still lead you down the path of action and doing bad things. Because you have to put everything into context as well. And I would, back to what we were saying at the beginning of the show as well, what Justin mentioned is responsibility. You've got to practice self-restraint as well. Otherwise, it just takes you down the path of violence, really. And this is up to a point. This is where governments really want to take you, is just to that limit, just before you explode, to keep you in a heightened state. So we are all subject to it, and it's. I mean, you'd have to. You have to really read the book. I mean, I can read you some extracts if you want, but it's so I could actually go back a little bit to why is it so prevalent in today's society, and it is. People probably don't realize it, but it is. So if we go back to, let's say, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, you have the Lenin that was trying to push Karl Marx's ideas. Now, he used an awful lot of propaganda, but by using propaganda to get people to adhere to Marxism, he actually had to destroy parts of the Marxist ideology. So what ended up happening is that it seems that the number one, well, let's put it this way: even if Lenin had in his mind the priority to have Marxism, he could only push Marxism on people if he had control beforehand. So the usage of propaganda became a totalitarian control tool prior to installing the ideology. And it's the same thing with Adolf Hitler, right, and Goebbels. So they used National Socialism as an ideology and as a social sort of system. But when they used propaganda, it eroded part of that, and it sort of catered for their inner desires as well of being dictators. So it feeds the ego as well. The more control they get over people, and so whatever their initial goal was, it ended up becoming secondary. And so you could also think of it this way as well: is even if a well-meaning democracy, let's say you have a well-meaning government and they don't use propaganda. Well, if they are subjected to foreign propaganda, the wider question is, can a democracy defend itself against foreign propaganda without using propaganda? And the answer is probably no. So, because you end up having a population that then becomes brainwashed by a foreign entity. So your own benevolent democracy all of a sudden is now finding itself having to use propaganda against its own people. in order to sort of defend it, but the people are not really free, right? So this is why one of my missions, and it's a big one, that I've set myself is to, in the future, to maybe do some sort of documentary just about propaganda, to be able to show people how much they've been subjected to it. And if they know the mechanisms of it and understand how their brain works, they could practice intellectual self-defense.
And you bring the great point there that if you're in a democracy that's functioning of its own accord, but there is foreign propaganda, and you're, one of the democratically elected leaders, and you see that this is a threat from afar, your choices are either let your people become brainwashed by a foreign entity, which more than likely has malicious intent, or do brainwashing of your own. And it's this fight fire with fire mentality that has more or less led to a world that is perpetually in a state of uncertainty about what is truth. Because as we've talked about already, the schools do not provide you with the tools of how to verify truth and think critically. The outcome of school is the ability to have contradictory ideas in your mind without a resolution, and for you to just believe whatever the latest authority has to say. And this is rather a recipe for disaster. But it's also a point where a solution steps in. And I was hoping you guys could touch on this a little bit as we're getting a little past this hour mark, is the purposes of public schooling is so that we stay in problem reaction. The purposes of education is so that we go from problem to thought to response. It adds that extra step of thinking. Now, if we had the tools to discern truth of our own without being told from an external authority what is and isn't truth, a lot of the problems that we're seeing are people in power trying to fight other people in power through the mass. Now, what do we do as individuals to not be a part of their plan? Because they need us to be fooled for their plan to work. How do we unbamboozle ourselves, start to take control of our own life, and not be pawns to other people's power plans?
I have two words: critical thinking and disconnection. How about that?
That does tie into one of the next things we were going to define there, and hopefully the purpose of this podcast in time.
Mm-hmm. Is this where we're supposed to say something called the Trivium?
This is where I am going to look up in this 1966 Oxford Dictionary of English Etymology. And I'm going to look up the word liberal. You guys want to fill the time a moment with something related to this?
Yeah. Well, when you just said liberal, I just thought as you've just mentioned there, you can look up the etymology. Well, I've just thought of liberty, of livre in French. I also speak French, livre, so it's Livre, which has the same root as liberty, which means a book, actually, in French. So, or library, you could say in English, right? So liberty and library have got the same roots.
And also, if you think about the word liberate, from whom you are liberating from is the oppression and subjugation from the outside, that you can practice critical thinking and then make your own mind about things. And when you have done that, then you can take action. which is the most important thing. I mean, there's an old Chinese proverb which goes something like this, that to know but not to do is not to know. The knowledge itself is nothing without action. You're just an armchair quarterback. You have to implement that knowledge into your life.
So let's take a look at some knowledge out of 1966 Oxford Dictionary, English Etymology. Now, when we think of liberal in the modern day term, at least here in America, I'm assuming most other parts of the world, it means left on the political spectrum, which is really interesting because library comes from the same root word, liberty comes from the same root word. How is it that we have redefined this term? I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in 1966, Oxford would have defined the etymology of the word liberal pertaining to the arts considered, quote, worthy of a free man, free in bestowing of political opinion. Now that's a very different definition from the left side of a political dichotomy. Now, what might that mean? Pertaining to the arts considered worthy of a free man. Yarmo.
Well, first of all,
yes.
Sorry,
AJ,
go ahead.
AJ.
Well, my initial reaction is, what are the arts of the free man?
Mm-hmm.
Pertaining to the arts of the free. Well, what are those arts?
Mm-hmm.
So there must be some sort of arts that we're not told about at school, I'm guessing, or maybe we are, but I don't remember being. I mean, arts. What did they teach me at school that had to do with arts? I played the flute for a year. That's about it.
That the art, the word, if you go back to ancient Greek, it is it's the same thing as technology, which is kind of interesting if you stop to think about it. So it's a method or a tool to do something. It's also meant
technology.
It's an art.
I was going to say technology comes from technique, right? So it's a precision tool, technology. It's to enable you to do something a bit more precisely. And I think that's probably where it rejoins the arts, is to refine something, maybe.
Well, it's also an artifice. It's an extension of man. It's something that man creates. You know, art is a representation of something. Art itself is not the thing.
So it's man's creation, arts.
Yeah, and to create, you have to have imagination, which is really, really, really important. And especially if you look at back to schooling, how they do such enormous work to cut that off from the individual. You know, once again, if you look at the small children, they can pick up the stick, and when they play, it's the mightiest sword. But then the parent or the teacher comes in, oh, throw it away, it's just a stick. And that destroys, it really destroys the imagination. That is really a violent act upon a child.
Yeah. So where did the word liberal come from then? When I mean, I don't mean the etymology or the meaning of it, or you know, what modern day meaning we have of it. But it seems to me, I mean, just stretching or just thinking a bit about the 20th century, they had something called international liberalism, which sort of came out after World War II. Because I would sort of suggest that the first part of the century, you had a lot more sovereignty. When I mean sovereignty, I mean national sovereignty. So there wasn't any sort of well, for example, the United Nations didn't exist back then. It was every country for themselves, and they had alliances and pacts with other countries, etc. So it was people had a very rough time in the first part of the century, very rough time, and so it seems that they had to tighten the screws in that first part of the century. So when they sort of created this, well, the United Nations, for example, they come up with the concept of international liberalism is to come together as countries, I guess, and then to unscrew a little bit of the tightening that was done before. And in fact, actually, just to point out how much of the unscrewing, you could say, or the liberalization of the world, you could think about the 1960s and 70s, right? You had all these the green movement or the Greenpeace and the hippie movements, which I believe the Trilateral Commission, who's this you could say a foreign policy think tank that was created in 1973, they wrote a book or a report that was called The Crisis of Democracy. And in there, they wrote that in the 60s, so there was basically an analysis of the 1960s. And in there, they wrote that they had an excess of democracy and that they needed to tighten it a bit more. So we see just by that illustration that democracy is this vague and fluid type of concept that they can tighten or let loose, I guess. So maybe that's how today the liberal side of the politics, the left side, when you look at liberals, it's gone way too far. Well, that's what I believe, but yeah, we won't be too political on this show, I guess. So there we go.
Yeah, we should say we lean neither right nor left. The political dichotomy itself, I'm sure we would all agree, is a divide and conquer scheme. And the real game being played, and why we started at defining freedom and slavery, because that's the real game being played. You know, the left versus right, like both sides are slaves. But the understanding of freedom versus slavery is, well, that's where the game is really being played.
Read.
Now, I did find the answer to your question, AJ. Of what arts does it speak when it says the arts worthy of a free man? And I think the answer is on page 944 of this book, under the word trivium. In the Middle Ages, the lower division of the 7 liberal arts being grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and of the upper 4, quadrivium, being arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Now, for people who are brand new to this concept, who have never heard of the trivium before, never heard of the classic liberal arts or the active literacies or anything along those lines, you're not alone. The question you want to ask is, if I went through 15,000 hours of public school, why don't I know about these things? And that's a good question to ask. And if you're looking for some answers, we're going to point you to a link over here where Richard Grove just spoke at the Freedom Under Natural Law Conference, where he goes through a quick summation of what the trivium is. But for the purposes of this show, we now have the definitions that the original etymology of the word liberal meant of and pertaining to the arts worthy of a free man. Those arts in question would be the classic liberal arts, composed of the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium being how to discern what is true in a way that the 3 of us and everybody listening to this podcast would able to be do on their own, because it is a method. What is the basic pieces? Why we're going through grammar in this episode. How do these pieces fit together, which will be logic for the next episode? And what conclusions can we draw from an accurate way that these pieces fit together, the rhetoric, the what do you do about it. And yeah, it's a 3-step process. It's not terribly difficult to understand, but it is if you don't know about it.
I think it can be summed up in a way that instead of to know what to think, it's about how to think.
Yep, I'd agree. I'd say it's a methodology, a process, you could say, of using your brain power. So it's a step-by-step process, really, because I think what's important as well to mention is that when you use the trivium, you mentioned grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Well, it's got to be done in that order, right? So you got to do the grammar first, meaning you have to gather some knowledge. So the way I sort of look at it is, if you're trying to tell a story, well, there's no good starting with the end, you know, or there's no good starting with the middle of the story. You have to, otherwise you won't be understood. You know, people are thinking, what? I don't understand. So when you start with the beginning, well, what typically happens when you start with the beginning? Well, you have to present the characters. You got to lay out the scene. You got to give a bit of context of you know, who the characters are, what they're doing. So typically, that initial phase of telling a story has got to answer the questions who, what, where, and when of the subject. And that basically constitutes the knowledge part of the subject, which is the grammar. And then the second part, the logic, has got to answer the question why. So typically, well, why is it that this is going on? Why is it that these characters in my story are doing this? And that, if you think about the story, that's all the adventure that's going on. And that's why it's happening, and you see the whole thing unfolding. And that typically represents the understanding of the knowledge, the understanding of the initial phase. And then the third part is the rhetoric, which answers the how of a subject. So indeed, if you when you talk about your story, when you go through it all, at the end, you have to be able to explain it. That's where the word rhetoric comes from. You know, it's the speech aspect of it. So how did all these things happen? So then once you've got the knowledge, the understanding, and you combine the two together, it's called something that's something that is called wisdom. So that's why it has to be done in that order: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So just to recap, it answers the question of who, what, where, and when, followed by the question why, and then the how is how you're presenting it, and the use of the rhetoric, which is the wisdom.
And it's worth noting that this method it's an observation of the way that we think and the way that we learn. It's not like one person was just like, hey, here's this really good method of thinking. You guys like it? Let's use it and call it the truth. It's an observation of how we learn. It is a format of how we communicate ideas. And when we know how to converse in it, if the three of us know the trivium, we can say, here's this subject that we know nothing about. But because we have a method, we can go through, we can capture the grammar, we can go through and we can sift out the logic and find how that thing fits together without contradicting itself. And then we can come to a conclusion based on that. And all three of us, if we're using the method correctly, will come to the same conclusion. And then we could say, this thing is truth.
One analogy which you can think about this is like, you know, computing terms: input, processing, output. And maybe the most important thing is input. If you think about a program, if your code is, you know, not good, no matter how much you process it, the output will be not good. So get your grammar input right, and then practice your brain power, logic, and then come to the output, wisdom. And not wisdom like you just you know that you know, but implement it in your life. Do something with that wisdom.
Absolutely. And on that input, can that be validated? Is the information you're taking inaccurate? And something that you have to consider when you're processing critical thinking is that there cannot be any contradictions. If you see a contradiction, it has to be resolved one way or another. So, if, for example, on a bit more of a provocative term, you have authorities saying this medical technology is safe and effective, but then you sign into your favorite alternative media channel and it says this medical technology is definitely not safe and effective. Now you have a contradiction. If you don't use critical thinking, you're doing what is called doublethink, because you're holding both of those things as potentially true in your mind at once. But if you practice critical thinking and you go ahead and say, okay, what are the sources for this claim? What are the sources for this claim? Oh, this one has sources. This one was fallacious. It used a fallacy to make that claim. Therefore, I must discard this piece of information in favor of this one unless more contradictory or superior evidence is presented.
And also one important thing is to look at the carrier who gives the information. I implement this thought in my life that I don't trust known liars because they have a history of lying. So how do I know that they are not lying this time? Then I try to find alternative sources and see out what they have to say and check their sources. How did they come up with this idea? How did the known liar came up with this information? And then I practice logic and just come to some sort of a conclusion based on the sources they both deliver.
And with that, when you're capturing grammar, what is the source of that claim? If you say, New York Times says this, but the Wall Street Journal says that, well, both of those should have sources as to where they drew their conclusion from. And it's those sources that you would actually want to look at to validate, is this a trustworthy source?
And I guess, I mean, I think you mentioned earlier on that we'll look at the logic aspect maybe at some other time. But yeah, once we get through that logic, we'll probably have a look at some of the lists of the logical fallacies, so as to try and root out the sleight of hand within language, because I mean, we all do it as well, because words aren't perfect, and the way our minds work, sometimes we skip ahead of ourselves sometimes, right? And you've got to sort of, again, practice restraint and think before you speak. That's what I was always told growing up. I used to speak a lot quicker than I used to think, so again, it gets you in trouble. But yeah, so that's the thing. So when we go through these logical fallacies, you'll be able to then pick up a lot quicker on some of the well, as I said, the fallacies and the misconceptions as well. Typically, one that comes to mind is experts say or sources say, without actually listing the experts or the sources. And so you're just supposed to take the information as if it were true without actually being able to verify or corroborate. And there's an awful lot of that goes on today, including in, what were or what are maybe still considered today as legitimate news outlets. but you'll probably find out that it's not the case anymore. That's for sure.
You just do what Ethan Klein says. You don't even got to think about it, bro.
Yeah, don't have to think about it, bro.
That's the experts went to school for that.
Yeah.
If anybody's
Yeah,
been
and
paying
also,
attention to this episode, there's plenty of fallacies there to be shot down.
Mm.
You were gonna say it.
And also media uses, especially in geopolitical issues, they use that, there's a think tank
Yeah.
come to this conclusion. Well, then you have to start to look the think tank. Who are where they get their money from, what they have said before, what kind of people they have. And when you start to peel the layers, then you start to get a bigger picture.
Yeah, you start to realize some of the influences and the powers that be, the want to try and control you at the end of the day. Yeah.
So before we go into this Christine Anders clip, to kind of close us out and give a good break from what we've been talking about, what conclusions, or rather observations, might we come to from our discussion today? We talked about freedom and slavery as a dynamic, with freedom being the absence of slavery. We talked about how schooling was brought in as a form of indoctrination as opposed to education. Education being something that draws out from within and has the potential to bring about freedom. Slavery being, indoctrination being, beliefs of others, some third party, usually an authority or a governmental figure, to follow a status quo or a norm, so that people coming out of schooling are part of this great flywheel of society that keep the momentum going. We've discovered the origins of the word liberal are of and pertaining to the classical liberal arts, which used to be an education that was, and still is, reserved for the ruling classes, those deemed worthy of being free. And, well, being in the 21st century, we now have access to learn these things, and that's why we're doing this podcast. Is that a pretty... Am I covering all the bases here?
Sure. I think you do.
Am I missing anything here?
I wouldn't say missing, but just to add something to it, that for somebody who is watching this, that you have the greatest, most powerful tool between your ears, and just start to using it in a correct way. And what I mean by that is, the critical thinking aspect, and learn the trivium. Because when you do, you start to get a clearer picture what's going on. And also you get answers for your questions, that what would be wise thing to do. And also what shouldn't I do in this situation?
All right. And then for a fun little video to top us out of this, we have Christine Anderson with a wake-up call. You cannot comply your way out of tyranny. Thank you for joining us on this initial voyage of This Is Going to Hurt. We're doing weekly episodes and coming back with the logic of this. And then the third episode will be the rhetoric of this. And then we get to really have fun getting into specific categories and isolating what we're talking about episode by episode. Let us know what you think. subscribe. It only gets better from here. If this was a little choppy for your taste, well, good, because we have to start somewhere. And any final comments before we switch to this episode, you guys?
Go, AJ.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, anybody, just to, a few words of encouragement to people listening out there. Just hang in there. You just got to keep hanging in there. It's not easy. I think we've all been through an awful lot through our lives. And when you come to the realization that things aren't quite what they seem, I guess your new life starts. And so it's uphill, but I think it's well worth it, because you will then, be autonomous instead of an automaton, as Richard Grove likes to say. But yeah, keep at it. Keep learning every day. Learn a new word every day if you can. Talk to people. Yeah, that's it.
Well said.
What I want to add is that I want to thank everybody who watched this. And it's going to be uphill for sure. But then if you think about it, everything worthwhile in your life comes after some sort of a struggle or a push. You just have to do it. And then the reward will be enormous, worthwhile doing this. So for everybody, just, keep going.
Solid. And with that, let's let Christine Anderson take us away with some words of wisdom and encouragement.
Stop giving your democratically elected governments the benefit of the doubt. They are not deserving of that. They are not. Stop rationalizing whatever your government is doing. Stop rationalizing and come up with some good intentions. They have no good intentions. Never. As I said before, in the entire history of mankind, there has never been a political elite concerned about the well-being of regular people. And it isn't any different now. Why should it? Stop giving them the benefit of the doubt. Because I can tell you, you cannot comply your way out of a tyranny. It is impossible. Trying to do so, you will only feed a gigantic alligator in the hopes of being eaten last. But guess what? Your turn will come, and then you will be the one swallowed up. I also have to ask the people, end your silence. Speak up. For God's sake, stop complying. Start rebelling. They're out to get you if you do not resist. I would also urge you to stop voting for those who inflict this psychological abuse on you, who mock you for their own good. In order to deal with this unfree world, to defy this unfree world, I have decided to become so absolutely free that my very existence is an act of rebellion. And that's what we all need to do.